Welcome to this video. It is an IELTS academic writing part 1 video. We're going to be looking at pie charts today. So without further ado, let's begin. The first step is to look at the context, and this includes countries and times. Mustn't forget the times. So, pie charts, as we just mentioned there, and the topic is average household expenditures. So, if you're like a teenager or if you're 21 and studying at university, you probably never think about this. If you're an adult, like if you're a bit older or if you're not living at home, you probably think about this quite a bit. So it might be a bit easier for you to analyze the situation. Okay, which of the countries? Number 1, Japan. How many countries? And Malaysia. So only 2 countries, interesting. And Japan and Malaysia. Have you ever compared Japan and Malaysia? I haven't. So this is going to be very interesting. Household expenditure in Japan and Malaysia. What have I forgotten? When? When is this? 2010. So I've only got 2 countries in 1 year, which is good. It means not a lot of information, not a lot of detail. Probably. Okay, so before we start thinking about Japan and Malaysia, it's easy to think about your own life to get a feeling for what we're trying to analyze here. So I'm going to tell you about my household expenditures. What do we spend money on? So we obviously spend money on food and drinks, regular expenses. We also tend to spend money on wining and dining, going to cafes and restaurants from time to time. Because we live in a country where the climate changes dramatically depending on the season, and we have 2 young children getting bigger and bigger, we do have to spend quite a bit on clothes. Other than that, I personally like to spend on books. I'm not sure what percentage of money is spent on books. Probably not a large percentage of money. And what else do we spend? I mean, we obviously have to pay the electricity bills and the water bills and stuff like that. Yeah, what else? What else would we spend money on? Presents and stuff like that. Yeah, we don't tend to spend a lot of money, it seems. Okay, so now we're looking at Japan and Malaysia. Thinking about Japan, what would they spend money on? Transport. Well, that's one of the things. I work from home, so transport for pleasure only. We don't have a car. We don't spend much on transport. But I imagine in Japan, they probably spend quite a bit on transport. Education here is free. I don't know if that's included in household expenditure. More or less free here. But I've heard, I had some Japanese students, and they said that costs of education are quite high, and a lot of money is allocated to cover those costs. Malaysia, that's probably lower. I imagine transport costs are lower. Okay, so we've thought a little bit about the task, what the costs are, and how much is spent on them. The next step is to then look at the actual graphs and see if they're similar to the picture that I just created then. Before we look at the graphs, you should press pause and think about your situation, your country, and your guess about Japan and Malaysia. Okay, we're back. Before looking at the actual statistics of Japan and Malaysia, it's worth looking at the actual categories that we're going to talk about. How many categories are there? Housing, transport, food, healthcare, and other. So we've got 4 categories and 1 other. Coming back again to the situation in my life, as I said, transport, very minimal. I imagine in Japan it's quite expensive. Malaysia, it's quite small. We're predicting here. Housing. What do you think about housing? I think housing again in Japan. I think everything in Japan's expensive. They probably spend a lot on that. Food, probably Malaysia more. I think, food's probably not cheap in Japan, but I imagine that its relative cost is quite small. Healthcare is an interesting one. If you have good public healthcare, then your costs will be small. Whereas if you have to pay for this, then I imagine that you have to allocate a lot of the household budget for this. Yeah, food, we've talked about that. Other goods and services, well, that could be quite chunky. Okay, so that's it really. I think now we can have a look at the actual graph. So let's look. And here we have it, Japan to the left, Malaysia to the right. I think what we can do here is just think about what stands out straight away. So we can see that one thing that stands out is they do look fairly similar. if we have a look at this blue before we even think about what that is, we'll call this point number 1. The blue seems to be quite similar, and certainly that yellow seems to be quite similar. And then the green in Malaysia is a little bit bigger than the green in Japan, and conversely, because of this possibly, that light blue in Japan is quite a bit bigger than the light blue in Malaysia, and then 6% and 3%, both very small. Okay, so we can analyze. The way I did this naturally is I just looked at the similarities and the differences. So the similarities are in transport, it looks to be. Is that the dark blue? It's not 100% clear, is it? No, I think transport's light blue. Dark blue is other goods and services. Okay, so that's one of our main points, that other goods and services occupies quite a lot in both countries. In fact, it occupies quite a lot, and then the more specific point, it's the biggest in Japan. And then another similarity is the food. That's interesting. I didn't predict that. I thought the Japanese relative cost would be lower, but the Japanese households, on average, allocate 24% of their budget. I suppose they don't allocate their budget, they actually spend. 24% of the money spent is spent on food, very close to Malaysia, 27%. Yeah, and that real big difference, the two big different ones were the transport. So, yeah, as predicted, transport in Japan is twice as big as in Malaysia. And don't forget, you need to be careful, the percentage of the household expenditure is twice as big. So you can't say that people in Japan spend more money on. I mean, it's probably true, but the graph doesn't tell us that. The graph just tells us that a bigger percentage of the total is spent. We don't know how much actual money. Okay, and then conversely, you've got the housing. A lot more is spent on Malaysia. In Malaysia on the housing. That's quite interesting. I didn't expect that. So, yeah, that occupies a lot of the Malaysian budget. So in summary, we can say that probably key point number 1 would be that spending on other goods and services and food and healthcare is reasonably similar in size. Reasonably, so they're not the same or not similar, but just reasonably similar in size. So that one there, they're fairly similar. However, the difference comes in housing, where it's much bigger in Malaysia, and transport, which is much bigger in Japan. Now, that's debatable, because in Japan, the healthcare is 6, Malaysia is 3, so it's twice as much. If we look at the transport, it's twice as much in Japan. So when comparing it in that way, you could actually argue that there's a big difference. It's just that it occupies a small amount, so the fact that it's twice as big doesn't play as big a role in the budget. But this is subjective. You can have different key points if you want. But they're my two, the similarities and then those two areas in which it's quite different. I just thought I might try and draw that actually. Might be a good idea. So, I can put maybe, what would be a good color? Black. Black can be the similarities. So, oops. No, I don't want that one. Here we go. So starting with this one here, these ones are all quite similar. Fairly similar. Proportionally. And then okay, so I thought I might indicate with color what I was talking about. So I'll put in orange the similar areas. This one here. And then it's debatable. Maybe you don't agree that these are similar. In fact, it's probably safer not to put them as similar. I'll put this as different. So this is the second point there. The purple indicates ones that are actually quite different in size. So I've changed my mind, which is okay in the planning stage. Okay, so we've got the orange point and the purple point. Okay, now we're going to have a look at a sample answer, and I suppose mark it according to a checklist that I have here. This checklist is based on the IELTS official IELTS criteria, and you got task response. That's how well you answer the question. So, does the introduction introduce all parts of the graph? So if you can remember there, all parts of the graph, you got Japan, you got Malaysia, you got its average household expenditures, you got the year 2010, and you've got the different categories. How many categories are there? So let's have a look at an example answer. Okay, the pie charts, that's good. We've got the pie charts illustrate the household expenses, so we can give that a tick. A big tick there for household expenses in 5 different spheres. Good, they've got the information. Japan and Malaysia, do they have the time? 2011. Was it 2011? No, it was 2010. Okay, so 2011, 2010. Be very careful. Okay, so that's the first part of the checklist. Next one, is there a paragraph or part of the introduction that highlights 2 or more key features? So if you remember, I had the 2 groups. They were my 2 key points. Let's have a look at the example answer. The main features, so there you go, they've even used the word features, so that's good. The main features are that most expenses in Japan are equally spaced. Most expenditures in Japan are equally spaced. See, this is what I meant by it's subjective. That's a good point. That's definitely true, that most of the expenses, 29, 21, 20, 24. Geez, I didn't notice that, but that's another way of looking at it. When I was an examiner for 10 years, this is what would happen. I would come up with my own ideas, and someone would answer it, and they'd have a different view of it. But yeah, that's a feature. That's definitely a feature. And that's one thing. If you're looking at how much money is spent, you want to know, like, where is it more, where is it less? And here it's like not really that much more or that much less, generally speaking, except for that one little section. 6%. And the person did say that most expenses, that most are equally spaced on the diagram. Well, that's not wrong. First of all, it should be in the diagram. You don't need to say in the diagram. It can't be anywhere else. So I'll just get rid of that. And in Malaysia, the biggest expense is housing. Okay, so let's have a look at that. The biggest expense is housing, and it is the biggest. It does stand out. It does stand out. So that's okay. That's okay. Obviously, the more of the graph or diagram that your key features, key points cover, the better. Okay, but that's it's a little bit dangerous. The examiner might say, well, there are some serious differences there, but maybe I was an open-minded examiner. I can see how the person would look and say, oh, Japan's equal, but bang, look at that big 34%, wow. Yep, so that's okay. That's okay. Coming back to our criteria, here we can put not all, here we can put yes, so that's a good sign. Okay, has the candidate missed any key features, important information? Not really, no. Unfortunately, it's a subjective exam. Another examiner might say, oh, you needed to look at that, but it looks okay. Does the candidate highlight, contrast, compare information in the paragraph, or is information presented mechanically? Okay, so here we have to look at the paragraphs. Okay, so if you remember that the 2 key features were that it was even in Japan and there was this big one in Malaysia. So this is more organization, coherence and cohesion, but it's still part of how you answer the question. It makes sense to organize it that way as you write. Let's have a look. So looking at the pie chart in greater detail. So first of all, pie chart. There are 2 pie charts. I don't know if I picked up on that before. The pie charts, yep, the pie charts. But here, the pie chart, we don't know which one. So it's not a big mistake, but it doesn't, are we looking at Japan or Malaysia? We can see that in Japan, okay, so the person's here, they've clarified. In Japan, healthcare has the least rate. Okay, so this is okay. It's information, and they're highlighting the fact that healthcare has the least rate. But if you remember, their point was everything was evenly spaced. So perhaps here they could have written something like, in Japan, the only section of spending that was different in terms of share from the others was healthcare, which had a significantly less rate. That would make the flow of ideas a lot better. So again, flow of ideas is connected with coherence and cohesion organization, but there is some overlap, there's some connection between the two first criteria, how well you answer the question, how you organize your ideas. Okay, what it means is that people in Japan do not pay for healthcare a lot. Okay, so this is true. People in Japan do not pay for healthcare a lot. Again, remember what I said about absolute terms of money. Maybe they pay a lot, but the percentage is quite low. It's debatable. But if you've already said that healthcare has the least rate, then relatively they pay the least for healthcare. The rate is 6% of the salary. So it's a very big part of this paragraph. It's a very big part of this paragraph. Let me get rid of that. To give one piece of information. So maybe, if you look at the diagram, if you look at the graph and you don't know what to say, this might happen. Then this is a good idea to spend a lot of time talking about not much. But yeah, it's definitely half that body paragraph to talk about one point. I also talked about that point for quite a bit, but I already started to compare it, contrast it with the other points. Okay, the next four equally shared categories are other goods, housing, food, and transportation, about 24% each. So, geez, that's okay, but if we have a look at our criteria, does the candidate highlight, contrast, compare information, or is it presented mechanically? Do they highlight the information? This one here is number 6. Is there any information missing? I get the feeling here that there's a bit of information missing because we have a lot of information about one category, which is 6%, but only an approximation of all the other categories, about 24%. But 24%, the yellow one there, what is that? Food is 24%. It is 24%, and then the other goods and services is 29%. So I think the key feature is there, but it's definitely not supported. There's quite a lot of missing detail to support that. Okay, so in the criteria of the IELTS, it doesn't matter if it's part 1 or part 2. If you present an idea but don't support it very much, then you're looking at a maximum of 6. So I think so far we've got the mistake in the beginning with the year. Then we've got quite a bit of missing information when it comes to Japan. So that one there, no. Highlight, contrast, compare information. Yeah, so there was no really comparing of information when it comes to the different categories in Japan, and that's where we're looking at a 6 for how they're answering the question. Let's have a look at the second body paragraph. Okay, so we're looking at the second body paragraph here. When it comes to Malaysia, the least expense is healthcare. In brackets, that's a very good idea. You can use brackets. It's not clear, maybe because it's quite small. I think it says 2. Don't forget, the examiner has to pretend that they haven't seen the graph. And fortunately, I can't remember. So that's a question mark. I'm not 100% sure what's written there. I've got a computer. I can zoom in, zoom out. I think it's 2. It's not 100% clear. So in the situation, the examiner has to pretend they haven't seen it. If it's not clear, you might be lucky the examiner says, oh yeah, it's 2, I remember. But if the examiner is pretending that they're a boss at work who's picked up your report and can't see that picture, is it 2? Is it 7? Yeah. And as it turns out, it's definitely not 2. Okay, so that's a big one there. While the most expensive is housing. So this is already better. I know straight away there's some comparison going on here. The least expensive is healthcare. The most expensive is housing. Again, one of the problems is the most expensive. It's better to clearly define it at the beginning. The most expensive in terms of percentage of expenditure is housing. But I mean, I suppose that's 34% of the salary. Okay. Did it mention salary? No, it's just about expenditure. So you need to be careful. It probably comes from the salary, but maybe not. Maybe they've invested a lot of money in on the stock market. We don't know. So you can only present the information that's there. Even though this is logical and it's probably true, we don't know, so we shouldn't present it. That's a minor thing, but it's something to remember. Okay. Then, so I don't know, with food, with 27% rate, okay, is it a rate of spending? I'm not sure about that. And then full stop and shouldn't begin a sentence. Okay, that's coming back to punctuation, probably grammar. And the last two are transportation with 10% and other goods with 26%. So I think this is a much better paragraph. You had some contrasting, you had some grouping, the last two with 10% and other goods with 26%. I think the problem with this, again, to highlight things clearly, transportation and other goods are put together. Transportation is 10%, other goods is 26%. However, if we look at food, it's 27%. So the percentage of food is a lot closer to the percentage of other goods and services, by the way. There's some missing information, goods and services, with 26%. So it's a little bit mechanical the way that's put together. Again, it comes down to, it is connected with organization, but putting it together logically helps give me a clearer picture, and that clearer picture is what gives you a high mark for how you answer the question. So let's come back to our checklist and talk about that. So we talked about, is there any information missing? We had some missing information. We had some inaccurate. And there we go. Is information presented mechanically? Okay. So they do fail to highlight in some cases. With Japan, they didn't highlight the differences. And then it was presented a little bit mechanically with Malaysia. So the end mark for something like that, the features are there, but they're presented fairly mechanically, in some cases not supported. You're going to get a 6. If the examiner doesn't like it, you're going to get a 5. Okay? Okay, so let's look through it again in terms of coherence and cohesion. Okay, coherence and cohesion. So the first thing we're looking at here, is there a clear introduction, body, paragraph, structure? And the answer to that question is yes. Does each body paragraph have a topic sentence? Okay, so let's have a quick look at that. Topic sentence, maybe the green. Looking at the pie chart, so that's good. We know that looking at the pie charts when it comes to Malaysia. So the writer has divided into 2 parts. One is about Japan, one's about Malaysia. They've signaled that very clearly here. We can see that in Japan. So to make that better, looking at the Japanese pie chart, or the pie chart regarding Japan. So that would have made a lot more sense to highlight that one there, and it would have made the topic sentence a bit clearer. So that's a very easy way to improve that aspect of organization. Okay, the next one. Does the writer use a range of linking words to join sentences and ideas? So I might just get rid of that. Oh no. What do we got here? The pie charts. Okay, I just realized that you didn't see that part there. I'll come down here, scroll down a little bit. There we go. So there we go, when it comes to Malaysia. Okay, so the linking words. Illustrate 5 in Japan, Malaysia 2000. The main features are that, so that's a lesion of this graph, you don't need it, are that most expenses in Japan are equally, and that in Malaysia. So there's good structure of in Japan and in Malaysia. The biggest expense is housing. That flows very naturally. looking at the pie chart, we can see it has the least rate. What it means is that people, so that's a good linking word. This information is not necessary, but it flows on quite well, but it's definitely not necessary information. Yeah. And the next 4 equally shared categories and other goods housing, about 25% each. So good use of each there. If we scroll down a little bit, when it comes to Malaysia, the least expensive healthcare, while, so there's some good linking words, the most expensive housing. So here we can see that the use of the linking words is not mechanical. The sentences and the clauses are put together very well. And that's why I think that's where the examiner would say, okay, because the ideas aren't organized together well, that's your task response going down. But the way you have put your ideas together, you've done that quite well using the grammar and the language here. Okay, it's housing, then food with 24% rate. Okay, and the last two are transportation. So again, the last two. Okay, so that's quite good. One of the things to push it up is that you have to use it skillfully. I think because of the level of organization of ideas, you know, we can't really call it skillfully there. But you know, I think that was actually pretty good. The answer to these is all yes. So no, doesn't overuse them. Uses a range. Probably could use more. Probably could use more of a range. And I think that comes if the writer had compared those Japanese spending categories a bit more, that would have involved more linking, more skill, and that would have pushed it up. Okay, so that's yes. Yeah, so the examiner probably give a 7 for that. They might say no, it needs a bit more skill, a 6, but it flowed very smoothly, so I'd say a fairly safe 7 for that one. They're definitely not an 8. Okay, grammar, range, and accuracy. No time, a bit later. Okay, let's move on to the next category, grammar, range, and accuracy. So what we're looking for is complex grammar structures and mistakes, like this one, spelling. Okay, so let's start with the range, or the amount of complex structures with grammar. Okay, in 2011, so nothing particularly complex. I mean, there's a nice long noun phrase here in 5 different spheres in Japan, Malaysia in 2011. Okay, the main features are that. So that's the main features are that. Okay, so that's a complex structure. Are equally spaced, complex. The biggest expense is housing. So the biggest, that's a superlative. Looking at, that's a participle. I'll make this a bit thinner. Okay, we can see that in Japan, healthcare has the least rate. Okay, so that's the least. That's another least one there. Probably should be the lowest rather than the least. So that's actually a mistake there. I don't know if that'd say it's a grammar mistake or a vocab mistake. Lexical resource. Okay, what it means is that, so there's a comma there, which is a grammar mistake. So I won't put it in green. I'll get it in red. There's a comma there. So that's a mistake there. But what it means is that, other than that, the grammar structure is quite nice. What it means is that, again, that width. Okay. People in Japan do not pay for healthcare a lot. The red 6% of the salary. Okay. The next 4 equally shared categories are other goods housing, about 25% each. Okay. So, moving down to the next one. When it comes to Malaysia, so again we've got a clause here, it's nice. The least expense is healthcare, while, so this is grammatically complex, while the most expensive, again the least expense, but again that's lexical resource, while the most is housing, then food at 24%. So with, mistake there with 27%. Okay, beginning the sentence with and, that's a mistake. So get rid of that, boom. Should be the same sentence, a small a. Is it a grammar mistake? I'm not sure. Appropriate, how sentences are joined. Again, some examiners might not mind they'll say that's okay. But I just don't think it's appropriate sentence division for more formal writing. So it's a dangerous one. I recommend not beginning a sentence with and. And the last two are transportation 10% and other goods with 26%. So I think what's good about that is it's quite accurate. It's quite accurate. What have we got here? Okay, does there is a range? That's how you know some. How often does the writer make mistakes? That's quite good, really. Are any of the mistakes noticeable? Not really. I mean, they don't stand out. They're not that big. There's like a little common mistake. Do mistakes? It's certainly not. Okay, so in terms of accuracy, we're looking at a 7 here because most of the sentences are error-free. That's a 7 in terms of accuracy. The range, you probably want a little bit more range. What else could you put in there? Maybe a few more comparatives, not quite as big as. A few more comparative structures would be nice. Maybe some more participle structures. Like comma, standing at 24%, comma, accounting for. And again, if the writer had compared the categories in Japan a little bit more, they would have had a chance to do this. So the examiner's probably a generous examiner would give you a 7, a harsh examiner would give you a 6 there. Okay, coming into the last section, which is lexical resource. Okay, so we've got to look for idiomatic expressions, precise meaning, spelling mistakes, mistakes with collocation, and how the mistakes interfere. So we're going to look for idiomatic expressions and precise meaning for range on one hand, on the other hand we're going to look for mistakes. So the pie charts illustrate, that's quite good. What does it say? The pie charts show. Okay, so that's well paraphrased. I'll give it a little tick. Illustrate is less common. Yeah. Household expenses. What was the language in the task? Expenditures. Yep. So that's showing good knowledge of language there. In 5 different spheres in Japan, Malaysia, the main features are, it's a nice little word, are the most expenses. Now we've got a repetition that looks to be a bit of a spelling mistake there. Looks to be a bit of a spelling mistake. It's not clear, but I think it's a spelling mistake. Okay, equally spaced. So that's precise, isn't it? Equally spaced. Okay, on the diagram, in the diagram. So a little preposition mistake. And in Malaysia, the biggest expense is housing. Okay, the biggest expense again. Is it the biggest expense, or is it the biggest expense in terms of percentage? No, it has to be the biggest expense anyway. Okay, in greater detail. So that's a nice one. Nice little collocation, in greater detail. Because this, a lot of people will pre-learn this, the examiner might not say, oh, this is wonderful. It's, oh, they just learnt this. Yeah. Okay, has the least rate. So we talked about that before. It has the lowest rate, not the least rate. So that's a collocation mistake. What it means is that people in Japan do not pay for. So that's good. That's collocation. Pay for. Healthcare a lot. Yep. So far what we haven't seen really are idiomatic expressions. Less common in idiomatic. So, some of these collocations you might be able to use allocation of expenditure. That would be less common. It's difficult. You have to be a little bit careful. Like something like it doesn't set them back that much. Set them back might be considered a little bit too informal here. So you need to be careful. And that's one of the things I don't like about IELTS Academic Writing Part 1. They ask you to use idiomatic expressions, but academic descriptions of graphs tend not to do that. But we need to. Okay, so yeah, here we've got percentage of the salary. So I mentioned before that salary isn't actually necessary here because we don't know. However, salary is a nice word. The next 4 equally shared, we're repeating that. Categories. So that's good. That's good. Did they use 5 different spheres before? Now they've got 5 different categories. So good paraphrasing. There's a range of language here. Okay, about 25% each. So looking pretty positive so far. Okay, when we come down, when it comes to Malaysia, the least expense. So again, that's not very good. The least expense. It should be the the lowest expense, the smallest expense would be even better. It's healthcare, while the most expensive is housing. So at least they're mixing it up a bit. They've got expenses, expense, expensive, pay for, perhaps, okay, a larger share of money is spent. They could have used more expressions like that. Then food with, did I pick up that grammar mistake before? I don't know if I did, with a 24% rate. So that's okay. I mean, is it a rate? Can we use rate here? 27% rate. It's not really a rate. Probably share. Share would be a better word. So I'll take that away. It's a mistake, but a minor mistake really. So some people might even disagree and say rate's okay. So yeah, we're not going to worry about that one too much. The last two. Okay, so what can we say about vocabulary here? Not much. There's not much there. As an examiner, I tended not to be too strict about idiomatic expressions, and it does have less common in idiomatic, so not much, but there was some there. I put some, and the good news is some is what it says for a 7. Yeah. Does the writer show precise meaning? That's something I didn't talk about much. Not a lot, really. Not a lot. I mean, there was that one about approximately. Equally shared, about. So I missed that one when I was talking about it. About's quite nice. About 24%, but it wasn't used that well. So I think there could have been more precise meaning, and that's when you compare and contrast in greater detail. I'm coming back to the graph. That's where you can use this. Like you could say in Japan, housing and transport stood at almost equal amounts of 21%. Yeah. Well, food was slightly more at 24%. Talking about Malaysia there, you could say that there was a stark contrast between the amount of money spent on housing and that spent on transport. So when you start comparing and contrasting, you can use these words like significant difference, stark contrast, roughly equal, barely perceptible difference. You can start using a lot more language when you start comparing and contrasting those. So I think thinking about the essay as a whole, that was the big mistake really. Talking here about Japan and not giving any detail really about the other 4 categories. Just that one little bit about a lot of information about healthcare, and then nothing about the rest of the graph really, or hardly anything I should say, because that brings down the task response, how you answer the question. It also brings down, it gives you less of an opportunity to use precise language or less common comparative language. That brings down your lexical resource. You can't use these comparative structures, so that brings down as much. So that brings down well, it doesn't bring down your grammar mark. It just means that there are less structures being used.